With this episode, we're going to look at the 6th decade of music that Neil Young has released. But let's recap for a moment. Let's take a look at how many albums he released in the 60s, and then the 70s, and in the 80s, and in the 90s, in the 2000s, and 2010. Now we're going to move to the decade starting in 2020. Now, we're only, as I record this, we're only at the beginning of 2024, 4 years into the decade, and Neil's already released 6 albums so far in this decade. You ready to go out to the barn? Well then, let's drop the needle. As this decade starts, Neil decides to take a journey into his past and go release an album that was recorded back in the 70s but never came out. And the album was called Homegrown. Now you might remember that we talked about this back then. Neil was going to release this album but decided instead to shelve it and release the album called Tonight's the Night, which started him on that ditch trilogy of records that he did back then. Well, anyway, now finally, out comes Homegrown. The album includes Separate Ways, Mexico, Love is a Rose, Homegrown, Florida, Kansas, We Don't Smoke It No More, and Little Wing. After all these years of hearing about this album, Neil's fans eat it up. It goes to number 17 in the US and number 2 in the UK. Neil really does not like Donald Trump as a candidate and expresses his concern and then sues Trump for using Neil's music at his campaign stops. Just before Christmas in 2021, Neil releases his 41st studio album with Crazy Horse, and it's called Barn, and it's his first album since the pandemic. As per the title, it was recorded in a barn in Colorado. The album is recorded live, and usually it features the first take of any song. Neil likes to work fast. I like Song of the Seasons, Heading West, They Might Be Lost, Human Race, Tumbling Through the Years, and Welcome Back. For his next album, Neil also decides to go back in time and release another quote-unquote lost album. It was recorded during the years 2000 and 2001, and it's an album that he called Toast because it was recorded in San Francisco at Toast Record Studios, and it features Crazy Horse. But instead of releasing Toast, Neil decides to shelve it, makes a turn, and records the album Are You Passionate? And so Toast has to wait 22 years before we get to hear it. Songs include Quit, Going Home, the epic Gateway of Love, and Boom, Boom, Boom. But the album struggles to find an audience. It can only get to 198 in the US and 23 in the UK. Later in the year, Neil and Crazy Horse team up with Rick Rubin as producer to record an album called World Record. Now, it's full of Neil's activism about the fragility of Mother Earth. Atypical for a Neil Young album, tracks are generally short, except for one. The opening is Love Earth, This Old Planet Changing Days, The World is in Trouble Now, Walking on the Road to the Future, and the 15-minute ode to Neil's fascination with cars, Chevrolet. And then once again, Neil decides to go back into the archives and release another lost album. And this one had been bootlegged a lot. And it's called Chrome Dreams. Now you remember, he had previously released an album called Chrome Dreams No. 2, but this album, Chrome Dreams, had never been released. Tracks include Pocahontas, Will to Love, Like a Hurricane, String Man, Powderfinger, and the unreleased version of Sedan Delivery. And then early in 2024, Neil releases an album that he calls a musical montage, and it's called Before and After. And I talked about this in detail in a previous episode, so you might want to check that out. But basically, each song kind of segues from one song into another, creating a real tapestry, and Neil really wants you to listen to this album from the start straight through to the finish. Tracks include, in the order that Neil wants you to experience them, I'm the Ocean, Home Fires, Burned, On the Way Home, If You Got Love, A Dream That Can Last, Birds, My Heart, When I Hold You in My Arms, Mother Earth, Mr. Soul, Comes a Time, and Don't Forget Love. Now, as I said in a previous episode where I did talk about this record, when I listened to it, it really felt like you were getting a private concert with Neil just sitting in your living room. So in just the first 3 years of this decade, Neil has already released 6 albums. And I certainly get the feeling there's going to be a whole lot more coming from him. Well, that wraps up 6 decades of music from Neil Young. These albums in 1960, these albums in the 70s, these albums in the 80s, these albums in the 90s, these albums in the 2000s, these albums in 2010s, and these albums so far in the decade 2020. What an amazing accomplishment. But Neil has also released 25 archive releases, 10 movies, many documentaries with Crosby, Stills, and Nash & Young, and with Crazy Horse. He's also written 2 books, Waging Heavy Peace, A Hippie Dream, and Special Deluxe, a memoir of life in cars. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the great biography about Neil called Shaky by Jimmy McDonough. Neil continues to be very busy, and if you check out his website, neilyoungarchives.com, you can find the latest that's going on in his life and all about his music, and believe me, there's a lot. Now, this series was really fun to do because Neil Young is one of the greatest artists that I've admired for over 60 years, and I've had the pleasure of seeing him perform live many times and even getting to speak to him. I also remember that back in those early days when he would walk around in that lovely fringe jacket at Buffalo Springfield days and beyond, I actually went out and bought a fringe jacket so I could look like Neil Young. And here's a really early photograph, kind of a bad one, but a really early photograph of me in that jacket. I've always had a really soft spot in my heart for the art of Neil Young, and I want to thank you, Neil, for all the great music that you've made so far over 6 decades. And please keep a rockin'. Now, I enjoyed doing this mini-series. It was a lot of fun. There are some artists, now not a whole lot, who have recorded for 6 decades, and I'll try to dig up some of those and see if maybe we can do something in the future. But I'll bet you can think of some. So if you know of an artist that has recorded for 6 decades and you'd like to see me do a series on them, please leave comments for me down below. We'll see what we can do. Thanks for watching. 60 years of great music. I'm sure we're all keeping a rockin'. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.